like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Marty Woldorff. Dr. Woldorff is a professor at Duke University with appointments in the departments of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, and Neurobiology, and with a laboratory based at the Duke Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. Dr. Woldorff's main research interests have been in advancing our understanding of the neural mechanisms of attention, and he will be presenting on his work funded by NINDS, investigating the interactive relationships between attention and reward, including discussing some of the potential translational applications of such research. So, thank you, Dr. Woldorff.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to, relative to the previous talk, I think I'll be talking more about some of the basic cognitive neuroscience first before going into some of the translational possibilities. So I'm going to first talk about attention. What is attention? Well, at each and every moment of our lives, we are bombarded by stimuli and information coming at us from a myriad of directions to all our sensory modalities. Much more information, much more stimulus inputs than we can possibly, than we can fully process or even adequately process. So what we need to do is to select and prioritize those inputs that are the most important or critical or interesting. And we do that all the time at every point in our day. So attention is a fundamental cognitive function that is critical to our navigation in the world. So let's take a look at some findings that we understand about attention and attentional control. So it's been known for a long time from behavioral work, back from Posner, that if you cue somebody to attend to a particular side of the visual field, let's say to attend to the right, because you're likely to get a target there, if it actually occurs there versus sometimes it occurs in the invalidly cued location, that you are faster to respond by detection or discrimination to the validly cued target. This is response time. And the idea there is that the reason you're faster and you're better at discriminating that target is because your attention has been shifted, has been focused on that place in the visual field. Well, we can also study what goes on in the brain during these sorts of tasks that underlie these cognitive and performance enhancements. So, for instance, we can do this in a couple of different ways. Probably the main two ways that we do this in humans is to record electrical activity from the scalp, EEG or event-related potentials, or to put somebody in a scanner and study them with functional MRI. EEG has very high temporal resolution. It's electrical, but rather coarse spatial resolution. fMRI has great spatial resolution, but rather low temporal resolution. And when we do that and we look at the effects of spatial attention on, say, a bilaterally presented display, what we see is that when you're attending to the left, you have enhanced activity over the right occipital cortex, contralateral to the direction of attention, and contralateral the other way. And this occurs at a particular point in time at about 100 milliseconds after the presentation of that bilateral stimulus. We look at functional MRI, we get a similar pattern for a contralateral activity, but here we know very well, with high resolution, where it happens in the brain, but really very little information about when. So these are enhancements in the sensory processing for attended stimuli. But there's a whole brain involved. There are other, how is this brought about? How are these sensory enhancements brought about? Well, in general, the general model that I'd say most people in the field would agree with is that there is an attentional control network, a set of regions in frontal and parietal cortex that control the allocation and direction of attention by sending modulatory signals down to the sensory pathways to enhance the processing of those inputs that are the most important or interesting or critical, and relatively attenuating or suppressing the processing of those that are irrelevant for the task at hand. So the way that would be implemented, say, in a cueing paradigm, is that after the cue, you get activation of this frontal parietal control network. This is now the fMRI again, and this is the EEG. There's some data from my laboratory, but other laboratories have found these results as well. And following this activation of the frontal parietal control network, we see a biasing in the sensory regions, in this case visual cortex, that happens even before the target comes. And by way of, there's other evidence that this is by way of these descending pathways. And so this biasing of the visual regions that are going to process the upcoming target, they bias them so that when the target comes through, it's enhanced. Its processing is enhanced, which is what explains those other figures that I was showing with as enhanced processing of attended sensory stimuli. And also then explains the enhanced performance, discrimination performance for those stimuli. So this was what would be called proactive attentional control, because you're kind of cued, you're told ahead of time to attend to a particular location in the visual field or for a particular color or whatever it might be. In the real world, that sometimes happens, but often what happens is that you respond reactively with attentional shifts due to things that occur in your environment. A bright, loud sound, a flash of light, the color red because you're looking for your friend with a red sweater. And so in those cases, you're not cued ahead of time. You get the stimulus you need to respond to, and that triggers a rapid orientation of attention. So one can study those sorts of things with, say, in a visual search paradigm, where you get, say, a display of a bunch of items, in this case, ellipses. One of them is different. It's a pop-out. Your task is to shift your attention to that pop-out. There could be two pop-outs, one that's relevant and one's not. You shift your attention to the relevant one to do a discrimination. And what we found, again, this is with ERPs, is that very rapidly after the presentation of this array, your attention is shifted to that. In this case, the blue indicates that your attention is shifted to the left. And this ERP component called the N2PC. And reflects this rapid attentional shifting of attention. Okay, so that's attention. Well, what about a reward? How does reward work, and how have folks studied it? Well, people have also studied the cued reward. What does reward cueing set up for you in terms of preparation for an upcoming task? And the classic task that's been used in reward research, probably one of the most common, is the monetary incentive delay task. So you get a cue that tells you you're going to get rewarded on that trial or you're not, or you're going to get a high reward or a low reward, and then you get a task, something you have to do something with, and then you get feedback that if you did it well enough, then you get reward under the reward condition versus a not reward condition. And under those conditions, you get faster reaction times as well, better performance on that task. But the focus on these sorts of studies is the difference between rewarded and non-rewarded cues, and you see activity changes in subcortical regions, in the midbrain and ventral striatum that have been talked about, or generally talked about, as part of the subcortical reward processing circuits. And that's been one of the main aspects of the brain that have been focused on by this sort of research. Well, and you can notice that paradigm where you get a cue followed by a task or target is very similar to those attention paradigms. But they've been done very, very separately. So let's say you have attention, you have reward. They both improve performance, at least typically. I'll show you some examples where that doesn't always happen. But they've mostly been studied in separate experiments, approaches, and literatures. But they have some sometimes strikingly similar paradigms. And in attention, the focus is on cortical frontal parietal cortical control networks that send descending signals down to modulate sensory pathways, also in cortex, in sensory cortex, whereas the focus in reward work has been mainly on subcortical reward processing areas, though various folks are looking at loops, particularly with frontal cortex. Well, are these the same? Or if not, which we presume they're not exactly the same, how do they overlap? How do they interact? So a number of labs in recent years, including mine, have focused on this interactive relationship or the possibility of interactive relationship between attention and reward. So I'm going to show you a few studies in that regard. So let's just take a broader look at a moment. So the key processing points where you could have interactions between attention control and reward. So you can have this proactive preparatory cueing for attention or reward to set up these proactive preparatory mechanisms. Or you can have an item that occurs, it can be particularly salient, say physically salient, like a bright pop-out, or it could have reward associated with it that could cause some sort of reactive, very rapid within trial modulation for that stimulus. Then you have your response, and then you get feedback that tells you that you did well, maybe gives you some money, and then that feedback has to come back to the system, and that feedback then helps update these reward associations. So let's take a look at these several facets of these interactive relationships. So first, let's take an attention and reward. So what if we cued attention and reward and compared them? So this is an EEG study where the cue now is a symbol that tells you this. So the ampersand tells you attend because you're going to get an upcoming stimulus in a moment. The particular task isn't important right now. Or you get a cue, say a dollar sign that says that you have to attend, but you're going to get rewarded, or you might get rewarded on this trial. And then there are control cues to compare to. And if we look at what happens under those circumstances, this is now the response to the cue before the target ever comes. And this is when you attend. So the cue happened out here. This is 400 milliseconds afterwards. Target could come out here, somewhere out here. So if you attend with no reward, you see this activation of the frontal parietal cortex that we looked at before, that people have been reporting with attention work. Well, what happens when you can also get rewarded? How does this change? What's the difference between when you attend with reward or attend without reward? And you can see that there's additional activity that's added that looks a lot like this. So it's this same activity, but larger. So this is added to this when you're attending with reward, because this is a contrast, attend with reward versus attend without reward. Suggesting that reward prospect accomplishes its performance enhancements in part by marshaling the attentional control circuits to do what it does to enhance performance. That's with EEG. Well, we can also look at it with fMRI. Again, cueing for attention and or reward. You get a cue. It's kind of a double cue. The details aren't matter, but maybe the color tells you whether you're going to get rewarded or not, and something else about the cue tells you it's going to be a difficult task, so you better attend more, versus you don't need to attend as much. And when you do that, we found that reward activates the subcortical reward circuits, as they've always been found to do, but they also activate the frontal parietal attentional control network. Again, consistent with the view that reward prospect marshals the attentional control circuits to help, at least in part, to help accomplish its performance enhancements. So we have to add something to this diagram now if we're going to put the reward and attention, the interactions in here. In particular, we can add the subcortical reward circuits that seem to recruit or marshal these attentional control networks to have them send their modulatory signals down to enhance sensory processing. There was other data that showed this cascade further on, but I didn't have time to show that here. So, and of course, the stimulus information that comes in, you probably also have to get something up to the subcortical reward circuits to start this process. Okay, so that was, say, advanced cueing. That's looking at the relationships between attention and reward for preparatory mechanisms. What about target-reward associations? So we can look at that as well. And what we did in this particular case was look at one of the particularly classic paradigm in cognitive psychology, probably perhaps one of the most well-known, the Stroop task. Where the task is, you're presented with a number of color words, and like red and blue, and your task is to say what is the font color of that word. So in this case, the answer is red. In this case, the answer is green. And when the semantic meaning of the color word and the font color match and it's congruent versus don't match, such as here, because you have the word blue in green font, you're slower when it's incongruent. And the idea here is that this is because this irrelevant dimension, this irrelevant feature, has distracted you some, had pulled some of your attention away, your cognitive control away, to slow you up. Well, what happens if we add, do the Stroop task, but with embedded reward associations? So what we did here in a series of studies, the first one was a behavioral study, where what happens when the font color might be rewarded. Certain font colors were rewarded, certain font colors were not. And what happens is that you get, that helps performance in two different ways. One is that when the font color is rewarded one, you're faster for both incongruent and congruent stimuli. When the relevant feature that you're attending to is rewarded, it speeds you up, but it also decreases the incongruency effect. It goes from here to here. So, so when you get reward for the relevant feature, it reduces that distractibility of other irrelevant features or items or distractors in the environment. Well, that's one way things can work. That's where reward helps you in your performance. But there's a flip side to this. In particular, what happens when the irrelevant feature, the color word meaning in this case, is indirectly associated with reward? So what if the word, the blue font is rewarded? The fact that, and you get this stimulus. The fact that it's the word blue is irrelevant. That's an irrelevant feature you're supposed to be ignoring. But you're supposed to say green here. But the word blue is there. So what happens under those circumstances? So we compared when the incongruent stimulus was not reward associated versus when it was reward associated. And what that did, it slowed you up even more. So this shows that if you attach reward, or if reward is associated with an irrelevant item in the environment or a relevant feature of an item, it distracts you more. So that's the flip side of what reward can do in terms of its push and pull on attention. So in this case, it misguides attention and impairs performance. We also did a series of fMRI and ERP experiments with this, looking at the neural mechanisms in the cortical, the reward processing circuits and the attentional control circuits, and how they interact to lead to this behavioral results. So that's target reward associations. Well, what about at this end here, where you get feedback that has to, somehow or another, you have to learn what's associated with reward in your life, what's going to predict good things for you. So we did a couple studies in that regard. And this one is a little bit more complicated. Well, maybe they're all a little complicated. But in this case, you're presented with these stimuli, and you have to make a bet. So it's a neuroeconomic task. You have to make a wager about whether you're likely to win or lose on this trial. So if you think you're likely to win, you bet high, 8. If you think you're likely to lose, you bet 2. And then you get feedback about whether you won or lost and how much. But the kicker was that these different stimuli, which were these odd characters that that none of them ever seen, are associated with the predict, or some of them had a higher probability of predicting winning on the trials versus a lower probability. And you don't know anything about these ahead of time, so you have to learn this during the trial. So you go through a number of these trials, and eventually you learn that these, say, predict you're likely to win, and these predict you're not likely to win. And so when you're likely to win, you bet high, and when you're not likely to win, you bet low. And people learn this across the time. Well, how do they do this? Well, we can look, first of all, at the response to the feedback stimulus when you find out whether you won or lost. And what we can see, there's a number of results from this study, but one of the results is that there's this big wave here. It's called the P300 wave, or P3 wave. And if you go back and you find out when the next time they encounter that cue type, do they change their choice, or do they not change their choice? Reflecting their learning about whether the reward association with it. And if they're likely to switch their choice, if they will switch their choice later, it's bigger than if they don't switch their choice later, which we infer likely reflects the marshaling of attentional resources as part of the process for updating the stimulus reward associations. Okay, so then what? What does that do then with attention in the future? So we looked at the feedback stimulus, but every time you're going through here, what happens when you hit those cue stimuli again? And you've learned that certain ones predict that you're more likely to win. So let's say you get this one is predicts a high probability of winning, this is a low one, or neutral. What happens to your attentional allocation? Well, we can look at this N2PC ERP component that shows that once you learn that this is the high predictor, you have an attentional shift. The blue reflects your attentional shift toward that one. And you learn this across the session. Also, this and the other wave vary across subjects. So there's individual variations. And this is stronger for those that do well in this task and learn well versus those who don't. Okay. So how are some of these findings in cognitive neuroscience, how can they be translated into society? Well, first, one major way is educational settings and materials. We know from elementary school, right, you get gold stars for doing well, gives you motivation, but we can do better than that. We can selectively associate with reward with certain items and in say, an educational set of educational materials as kids or anybody learn stuff. This can be used also in training protocols. Let's say with pilots who have a very complicated visual display in the cockpit, people do studies with visual search where you have certain salient items or certain reward-associated items that can help you learn how to do this better. And this can also be custom-tailored to those individuals who need to do rehabilitation for various neurological disorders or stroke or mental disorders to help them learn or relearn those facets of processing that they have become impaired at. Another way, we talked about decision making. You were choosing betting high, betting low, this item or another. Well, marketers are already using this to look at, well, you attend more if you see a Coke versus Pepsi, if you have different bottles, different wrappers, especially after seeing advertisements. So this has already been done by marketers around the world. You could also do this in a more altruistic way to try to influence people to make better choices. Say kids who, if you give them a task where they're supposed to find a certain color, let's say gray, and it just so happens that an apple is laying on that gray versus a Kit Kat bar, you could influence their association of positive reward with the apple. Addicts have their attention drawn by addiction-related materials, such as a cigarette package. And you could also do a similar thing with that to help retrain their tendency to have their attention drawn to their addiction-related items, distracting them from what other things they should be doing in life. And lastly, this idea of reward and your marshaling of attentional resources because you care about certain things more or less. What we found in a recent study by Renee San Martin that that this same positive wave that reflected these marshaling of potential resources, the size of that wave predicted your likelihood of giving to charity in everyday life and how much you would give. So I'd just like to end by thanking all the collaborators that helped, that contributed enormously to all these different studies, and to acknowledge the financial support particularly from NINDS, as well as some support from NIMH and NSF. And I thank you all for your attention.